I don't know who's going to read this. I don't know if anyone will. Command told me to write it down, said it was for the record, said it was for posterity. That word, posterity. Like someone somewhere is going to sit down 100 years from now and flip through this like it's a history book, underlining the interesting parts with a yellow marker. Maybe they will, I don't know. What I know is this: I was there. I saw what happened. And if I don't write it down now, while my hands are still shaking and the smell of ozone is still caught somewhere in the back of my throat, I'm going to start second-guessing myself. I've seen that happen to people. Good soldiers, steady people, who watched something impossible and then slowly, quietly, started convincing themselves it wasn't. I'm not going to do that. So here it is. The whole thing. Everything I saw and heard and felt, starting from the beginning of that shift and running all the way through to the morning when we really realized, what humans had done. What one human had done. Let me start by telling you about Kepler Station Outpost 9, because if you don't understand the place, you won't understand anything else. Outpost 9 sits on the outer rim of what the Galactic Concordat calls the Neutral Engagement Zone, a fancy name for a strip of space and planetoid territory about 40,000 kilometers wide, where no single species is supposed to have military dominance. It was written into the Akari Accords about 60 years ago, back when humans were still relatively new to the interstellar table, and the older species were trying to figure out what to do with us. The Accords were supposed to be a peace agreement, a structure, rules everybody agreed to so that the Concordat could manage diplomatic relations without things turning into a firefight every other Tuesday. Kepler Station was built on the edge of that zone, on a planetoid called Scratch, named by the first survey team that landed there, who said the whole surface looked like something had clawed at it. Long, deep ridges running parallel across the rock, carved by ancient geological forces that nobody really understood. The atmosphere was thin but breathable if you had a filter mask on, and the temperature swung between uncomfortably cold and dangerously cold, depending on how close you were to the night cycle. We had about 300 people stationed there at any given time, mix of human military personnel, civilian researchers, and a rotating roster of Concordat observers from various species who were supposed to be there to make sure nobody was violating the Accords. The observers usually kept to themselves. They had their own section of the outpost, their own mess hall, their own environmental controls set to whatever atmospheric conditions their biology preferred. You'd see them sometimes in the corridors, usually moving in small groups, never making eye contact if they could help it. Most of them were Trivari or Yenkai species that had been in the Concordat for centuries, older than our recorded interstellar history, generally polite in that distant, formal way that told you they tolerated your presence rather than welcomed it. You got used to it. You stopped taking it personally after about the third week. But the night this happened, there was someone new on the station, someone who wasn't a Trivari or a Yenkai, someone who wasn't an observer at all. My shift started at 2200 hours, standard station time. I was doing a perimeter walk on level 3, the mid-ring corridor that runs around the outer shell of the station's main hub. It's a long walk, circular, about 1.5 kilometers if you go all the way around. Cold equi, lit by strip lighting that somebody had set to a blue-white tone that always made me feel like I was walking through the inside of a freezer. Most nights it was quiet, the occasional maintenance drone humming past, the low vibration of the atmospheric processors somewhere in the walls, the distant sound of someone's music leaking through a poorly sealed door on the residential block. That kind of quiet. I had Staff Sergeant Riku Akafer with me that night. We'd been partnered on perimeter rotations for about 6 months, and I say this without any sentimentality. Riku was the best soldier I've ever had the privilege of standing next to. Not the loudest, not the most decorated. He wasn't the type who told war stories or went looking for trouble. He was just steady. calm in a way that wasn't performed. The kind of calm that comes from someone who has genuinely thought through what they are and what they're there to do. He was taller than me by about a head, had these long arms that made his rifle look almost small when he carried it, and he had a habit of cracking his knuckles, one at a time, methodically when he was thinking. 40 years old, from Lagos originally, spoke 4 languages and understood 2 more. Had a daughter back on Earth he was always talking about. Showed me her drawings sometimes on his datapad. Kid was 7 and she drew spaceships with remarkable accuracy. He was good people. That's the simplest way I can say it. We were about 40 minutes into the rotation when we passed the junction near compartment 3G. It's a service access point, kind of a dead end branching off the main corridor. Has a storage rack on one side, a utility panel on the other, and usually smells like coolant because of a microleak they'd never gotten around to fixing. Riku stopped. I stopped too, because when Riku stopped, you stopped. That was just the way of things. He didn't do it randomly. He was looking down the branch corridor toward 3G. I followed his gaze. There was nothing there, or at least nothing I could immediately see. Just the dark mouth of the service alcove, the strip lighting ending a few meters in, shadows beyond. "You hear something?" I asked. He didn't answer right away, just kept looking. Then he said quietly, "Pressure change." I didn't understand what he meant. I was about to ask when I felt it too, a subtle shift in the air against my skin. Not a draft exactly. More like the specific feeling of air moving in a closed space when it shouldn't be, when something changes inside a sealed environment. The atmospheric processors don't produce that sensation. This was different. "Log it," he said, and reached for his radio. That's what I want people to understand about what happened next. We didn't panic. We didn't run. We didn't start broadcasting alerts and calling the whole station to general quarters. Riku Akafor logged the anomaly calmly, reported it through proper channels, and then he and I moved carefully to check the source of it. That's training, that's discipline, that's what humans do. Riku took the left side of the alcove entrance. I took the right. We had our rifles up, lights on the underside of the barrels cutting through the dark of the service corridor. Everything was controlled. Everything was by the book. What was inside the alcove was not by any book I'd ever read. It was tall, taller than Riku, maybe 2.5 meters, and built in a way that I don't have clean words for. Not bipedal in the human sense, though it was standing on 2 legs. The legs had an extra joint, an articulated bend backward below what should have been the knee, and it stood in a low crouch that should have looked unstable but didn't. It looked natural. Like how a cat looks natural even when you're staring at it from an angle that makes no ergonomic sense. It had 4 arms. 2 upper, 2 lower, each with too many fingers, and those fingers were long and tapered and ended in points that weren't quite claws but weren't not claws either. Its skin, or what I was seeing as skin, was dark, a deep matte charcoal color, and it had a pattern of faint bioluminescent markings along the neck and upper torso that pulsed slowly, like breathing. Its head was narrow. Eyes were large, horizontal pupils, iridescent green in the beam of my rifle light. No visible nose. A mouth that was a thin horizontal seam at the moment, but that I later learned could open in ways that bore no resemblance to anything human. It was wearing something. Not clothing exactly, more like a harness, close-fitted, covered in small mechanical components I didn't recognize. Pouches and housings, and what looked like folded metal the way origami is folded. Everything tucked and latched into precise configurations. Later, I found out what those were. Later, a lot of things became clear. But right then, in that moment, I just knew 2 things. 1, this was not a registered observer species. I'd seen every species that had clearance on Kepler Station 9. This was none of them. And 2, it was looking at Riku. Not at me, at Riku, specifically directly with a focus that I can only describe as professional. The way a surgeon looks at a patient before making the first cut, assessing, precise, like everything had already been decided and what was happening now was just the confirmation. It moved. I don't mean it started to move. I mean it moved past tense and present tense at once, the motion too fast for my brain to insert a transitional moment. 1 second it was crouching at the back of the alcove. The next it was 4 feet from Riku. I fired. I want to say that plainly without dressing it up. I discharged my weapon, standard K7 pulse rifle, setting 3, which delivers enough electromagnetic disruption to drop a Travari or stagger a Yinkai in medium armor. I was in a good position, clear line of sight, and I put 2 rounds into the thing's left side. They hit. I saw the bioluminescent markings flare, saw it flinch, a real flinch, physical, involuntary, so it felt it. It wasn't immune to the pulse. But it didn't stop. It turned its head and looked at me for about half a second. I don't know how to describe what that look communicated. It wasn't rage. It wasn't fear. It was something colder than either of those things. It was the look someone gives a minor inconvenience that they've already accounted for. Then it turned back to Riku. And Riku put his rifle on his shoulder sling. I remember that. I remember watching him do it, fast and deliberate, the way you do when you're giving up your rifle to use both hands. And I thought for one awful second that he was surrendering, that he was going to put his hands up, and I thought, no, that's not. He stepped into it. I mean, he physically closed the distance, grabbed it, both hands, one on the lower set of its arms, one somewhere on the shoulder joint of the upper set, and he just moved with it. Like a dance, like a grapple, like something I'd seen in training videos for close quarters combat against non-standard physiology. I kept firing. I had to. I couldn't get a clean shot that didn't risk hitting Riku, so I was aiming low, trying to catch the legs, slow it down, change its balance. They went into the wall together, then the floor. I heard sounds I don't want to reproduce in writing, impact sounds, the crack of something hard against something harder. I was yelling. I remember yelling, though I couldn't tell you what I was saying. Probably nothing coherent. Just sound the way your body needs to make sound when your mind is trying to catch up with something it can't process. My radio was transmitting. The alert had gone through. I could hear response units already queuing in the comms channel, voices, movement, boots on metal somewhere above us. I moved to the edge of the alcove entrance and kept firing. It ended, the initial engagement ended, in a way I didn't expect. The alien disengaged. Riku had done something to one of the lower arms. I don't know the exact mechanics of it, but there was a sound like a structural failure, and then the thing pulled back fast, its body language changing for the first time from methodical to something more urgent. It retreated to the back of the alcove, and in the light of my rifle, I could see the bioluminescent markings had changed pattern. Different rhythm, different intensity. I know now that those markings are a communication system. What they were saying, the xenobiologists told me later, was something that translates approximately to threshold reached, reassessment required. It had hit a threshold. Whatever calculation it had made coming in, whatever it had decided about this mission, about this target, about what level of resistance to expect, it had just crossed a line that required it to recalculate. Riku was standing between me and it, breathing hard, one hand pressed to his side, which I would later learn was where one of the thing's tapered fingers had caught him, a superficial wound, not deep, but it was bleeding and he knew it. He was looking at it. It was looking at him. Nobody was doing anything, and for about 4 seconds, the service alcove was the quietest place in the galaxy. Then the reinforcements arrived. I received the alert at 22:47 hours. By the time I reached level 3, Corporal Wolf and Staff Sergeant Ackafer had contained the situation to compartment 3G, and 8 additional personnel from the response unit had established a perimeter at the corridor junction. Nobody else had fired after Wolf's initial engagement, which was correct. The service corridor was too enclosed for group fire without serious risk of friendly casualties. What I found when I arrived was a standoff. The alien was pressed into the rear of the alcove. It was not attempting to advance or escape. It was crouching in what I would come to understand was a neutral posture, the physical equivalent of a comma mid-sentence. Not finished, not ready to resume, waiting. Riku Akafor was standing approximately 3 meters from it. He'd been given a field bandage for the wound on his side but had declined to move back behind the perimeter. He stood with his arms at his sides, rifle slung, and he was talking to it. I need to write that again, because it's still remarkable to me when I think about it. He was talking to it. Not in any language I recognized, because of course there was no common language between humans and whatever this thing was. But he was talking. Calm, slow sentences, same tone throughout, no aggression in the sound of it. The way you talk to a dog that was cornered and frightened if the dog weighed 200 kilograms and had 4 arms. He told me later that he didn't know why he'd done it. He said he'd figured that silence was more threatening than sound and that there wasn't much else he could do. He said it seemed like the thing was thinking, and that if it was thinking, then maybe it could hear something in his voice even if it couldn't understand the words. Some signal underneath the language. Some signal that said, "I'm not a threat right now. Are you?" Whether that's what the alien understood, I can't say. What I know is that it didn't move. And when I stepped up beside Riku and identified myself and began the standard first contact protocol, the one that frankly none of us ever expected to actually use, the one that sits in a procedure manual gathering digital dust in a folder labeled theoretical contingencies, the alien's bioluminescent markings shifted again. Slower now, steadier. Listening. The next 4 hours were the most surreal of my career. We had no universal translation for this species. None. It wasn't in the Concordat registry, not in any of the databases we could access, not in the suppressed files that I have clearance to pull. However, whatever this thing was, it had arrived at Kepler Station 9 outside any official channel, which meant either it was operating completely independently of the Galactic Concordat's knowledge, or it was operating with knowledge that the Concordat had chosen not to share with us. Both options were alarming in different ways. What we did have was a xenolinguistics assistant program on the station's main intelligence system. Dr. Yenna Harrow, our lead xenobiologist, had installed it 18 months prior for research purposes, not crisis management. It was designed to analyze unfamiliar communication patterns and generate preliminary structural maps. Not translation, just structure. The shapes of a language before you know what any of the shapes mean. Dr. Harrow had it running within 20 minutes of being woken up and briefed. She sat on the floor of the corridor outside compartment 3G with a portable terminal on her lap, hair still disheveled from sleep, and she worked with the focus of someone who had been waiting her whole career for exactly this kind of problem. I will say that about Dr. Harrow, she was not afraid. She was the opposite of afraid. She was practically vibrating with the contained energy of someone who had just been handed something completely unprecedented and was determined not to waste a second of it. The alien's bioluminescent markings provided most of the data. Harrow's program mapped the pulse patterns, the color gradients, the relational intervals between different marking zones along the body. It cross-referenced them against known biological signaling systems in the Concordat registry. And it found a partial match. Not a translation match, not a language match, but a structural match. The underlying logic of the communication system bore resemblance to a signaling protocol used by the Akari, the species that had brokered the original Concordat Accords 6 decades ago. Now the Akari are not a species anyone knows a great deal about. They're ancient by any standard. They've been part of the galactic diplomatic ecosystem for longer than most current Concordat species have had spaceflight. They don't attend summits. They don't do observer rotations. They occasionally send communications, and occasionally those communications are acted upon. But whether anyone fully understands the Akari or their motivations is, at best, an open question. Finding their structural fingerprints in this alien's communication system told us several things. 1. This creature had some connection to Akari systems or Akari history. 2. Whoever had sent it here knew something about the Akari that wasn't in any database we could access. 3. The situation we were dealing with was much larger than a perimeter breach. I relayed all of this up the chain immediately. Commander Vash's response, when I reached him, was 4 seconds of silence followed by, "Keep it contained and don't let it die." Those were his exact words, "Keep it contained and don't let it die." Which told me that whatever was happening here, the people above me already knew at least some of the context, and had decided that this alien being was more valuable alive than explained. I've submitted formal reports through the proper channels. This is the other version, the one that tells you what it actually felt like to sit 12 feet away from something that had come here to kill a human being, and instead was now watching me type. Watching is maybe too simple a word. It observed. There's a difference. Watching implies passive attention. This thing observed with the intensity of something that was reading every layer of what I was doing simultaneously. My hands on the terminal, my posture, my breathing rate, the direction of my eyes when I paused to think. It missed nothing. That should have been terrifying. It wasn't exactly. I know that sounds like the kind of thing that gets psychologists called in, and probably they will be, and probably that's fine. But I've spent my career studying non-human life, and I've learned that fear of observation is a very human instinct. Rooted in predator-prey relationships we haven't been evolutionarily current on for thousands of years. Being watched intensely doesn't mean you're in danger. It means something is trying to understand you. And I genuinely think, that this creature was trying to understand me. More than that, it was trying to understand humans, trying to figure out what we were. The attack on HFY wasn't random. I want to put that on record clearly. The alien came to that specific location at that specific time with a specific target. HFY's personnel file isn't classified, but his service record does include some notable entries: 2 cross-species liaison incidents, a commendation for conduct during the Brennan's World territorial dispute, 3 years of prior service on Concordat-adjacent installations. He wasn't just any human. He'd been chosen. By whom and for what reason, I couldn't say that night. What I can say is what the structural analysis of the communication markings told me over the course of those 4 hours. They told me that the alien was afraid. Not of us, well, not primarily of us. The fear signal, once I identified it in the marking pattern, was pointing in a different direction. The Akari structural elements in its language were expressing something like dread toward an absent third party. Something that wasn't in that room. Something that had given it instructions. I wrote in my notes at the time, this creature did not choose to come here. It was sent. And then, a few lines later, and now it is reconsidering what it was sent to do. Here's where things get complicated in ways that I'm not sure the formal report captures fully. Around 200 hours, the alien initiated what I can only call a voluntary communication act. It hadn't made intentional signals directed at us before that point, other than the defensive neutral patterns during the standoff. For the first 2 hours of the documentation phase, it simply stayed still and let me gather data. Calm. Controlled, waiting. At 200, it raised one of the upper arms, slowly, deliberately, making no sudden movements, and extended 2 of those long tapered fingers toward the terminal screen I was working on. Everyone's weapon came up. Everyone except Riku Akafur, who by that point had come to sit beside me on the floor, having refused a medical evacuation despite being told several times that his wound needed proper treatment. He was the only one who didn't react. He just watched. The alien held the gesture for a moment. Then it lowered the arm. Then it did the same gesture again. I understand now that it had read enough of my documentation process to understand that the terminal was my communication tool. It was asking, in the only way it could, to interface with it. I looked at Solis. Solis looked at me. Then she looked at HFY, because by that point, in some informal and entirely unremarked upon way, HFY had become the person we were all defaulting to in moments of uncertainty. He was the one who'd been in contact with it first. He was the one it had initially come for, and then failed to kill, and then chosen to not kill a second time when it had the opening, and then, in this strange, unreadable way, seemed to be treating as a reference point. HFY nodded slightly. I set the terminal where the alien could see the screen. I've never liked writing. Destat is the talker, the one who can get words into order. I'm more of a I do things and then things are done. But Lieutenant Solis said all of us needed to file, and she was right about that, so here I am. The attack, the fight, the standoff, Destat and Dr. Harrow described all of that better than I would. What I can add is what was going on in my head. And in my gut, because honestly that night the gut was doing more of the work. When I saw it in the alcove, I had about 3/4 of a second to make a decision. Destat had already fired. The thing had already moved and I'd already felt how fast it was. My pulse rifle wasn't going to be the answer, not at that range, not with that speed differential. The only advantage I had was mass and close contact, because at close contact, fast doesn't always beat heavy and trained. So I went in. I don't want to make it sound brave. It was just math. I ran the calculation, and that was the answer the calculation gave me. The fight itself, there's not much to say about it that sounds clean in the retelling. It was ugly and it hurt, and it was over faster than it felt while it was happening. What I remember most is that at the moment it pulled back, at the moment I realized we'd reached some kind of pause, I looked at it and I thought, it's deciding something. I've been in enough situations with enough different kinds of people to recognize the physical signature of decision-making, the stillness that isn't passive, the quality of attention that's turned inward. This thing was deciding something, and whatever it decided was going to matter. So I talked to it. Like an idiot, like a man who doesn't have the sense to be afraid, like someone who has spent enough years on the frontier of things to believe that somewhere under any language there's always something recognizable. I talked and I kept my voice level and I tried to just be still in myself. No threat, no performance, just present. I don't know if that's what changed its mind. I don't know if anything I did changed its mind. Maybe it just recalculated and we weren't worth the cost. Maybe whatever was scaring it about whoever sent it was scaring it more. Maybe it was something else entirely, and I'm flattering myself. But it didn't move, and then the lieutenant arrived, and then Dr. Harrow. And eventually, we ended up all sitting on the floor of that cold service corridor at 2 in the morning, and somehow the situation had transformed from a killing into a conversation. What it communicated through the terminal was limited by the structural analysis Dr. Harrow had. She was working with pattern matching, not true translation, so everything she interpreted was necessarily approximate. She was clear about that every time she told us something. This might mean, the pattern suggests, I'm approximating. I appreciated the honesty. In situations like that, overconfidence kills people. Here's what she extracted. Over about 2 hours of patient interface work between herself and the alien, while the rest of us held the perimeter and tried not to breathe too loudly. 1. The alien species is called, in the approximate phonetic rendering of the Akari structural language elements, the Vreth. They are not in the galactic concordat. They predate the concordat by approximately 800 years. They have been aware of the Concordat's existence since its founding. They have chosen not to participate. 2. The Vreth have a social and cultural category called, and Dr. Harrow struggled with this one, spent a long time revising her interpretation, something like a person who crosses thresholds on behalf of others. Her first approximation was agent. Then she refined it to emissary. Then she sat back and looked at the alien for a long moment and revised it again to instrument. The alien didn't correct her, but its markings shifted when she landed on that last word, and she said the shift pattern indicated something like acknowledgement. Instrument, not soldier, not assassin, though it had behaved like one when it arrived. Instrument, something used, deployed, directed. 3. It had been directed here by someone within the Concordat, not outside it, inside. Someone with enough reach, and enough information to know what the Vreth were, to know how to contact them, to know how to direct one of their instruments to a specific human soldier on a specific outpost at a specific time. That information, when Solis relayed it up the chain, produced a silence from Commander Vash that lasted a full 11 seconds. I counted. 4, and this is the one that I'm not sure I fully understand even now. The alien had arrived with a task, and it had not completed that task, and it was explaining that the reason it had not completed it was that something about the completion had. Dr. Harrow went very quiet when she worked through this part. Something about the completion had felt wrong in a way it was not designed to feel. Not strategically wrong. Not tactically wrong, wrong in a different sense. Dr. Harrow looked at me when she said that part. She didn't say what she was thinking. She just looked at me, and I looked at her, and then I looked at the Vreth, and the Vreth's markings were doing something new, something Harrow later told me was the closest equivalent in their signaling system to what humans call uncertainty. An assassin trained and deployed for purposes of political elimination had arrived at its target and had felt, mid-mission, that something was wrong. Not the mission, the task, the instruction, whatever it had been told about us, whatever it had been given as the context for what we were. It had gotten here and discovered something that contradicted that context, and it had stopped. At around 400, Commander Vash arrived in person. He doesn't do that often. He's a remote command man by temperament and policy. But he came down to level 3 himself, which told you everything about how seriously he was taking it. He stood at the entrance to the alcove for a while, looking at the Vreth. The Vreth looked back. Then he said quietly, "Can it understand me?" Not the words, Harrow said, but possibly the tone. Vash nodded, and then he did something I wouldn't have predicted in a million years. He took a step forward, just one step, into the threshold of the alcove, and he stood there, visible, arms relaxed at his sides, and he said, in the measured voice he uses when he means every word, "We don't know who sent you here or why. But you chose not to complete the job. That matters. We're going to try to understand what that means." The Vreth's markings flickered. Harrow, watching the terminal, made a sound that was almost a laugh. "What?" Vash said. "The pattern," she said. "It just expressed something I'm reading as respect, provisionally, but it's there." Vash looked at her for a moment, then he looked back at the Vreth. "Good," he said, and that was the end of the conversation. Just before first light, not real light, since we don't have natural light cycles on a station, but the 600 shift change that everyone informally treats as morning, Dr. Harrow noted something that the rest of us had missed. The Vreth was different. Not visibly different, not in any dramatic physical sense. But the harness it was wearing, the harness full of folded metal components and pouches and mechanical housings that I'd cataloged mentally when I first saw it in the alcove, had changed. Some of those components were gone, missing, removed carefully at some point during the 4 hours we'd been sitting in the corridor together. Harrow figured out what they were about 20 minutes after she noticed. The folded metal components deployed and activated would have served as a dispersal mechanism for a neurological compound. She used the technical term, but I'll use mine. A nerve agent, airborne, delivered through a small ejection system built into the harness. Non-lethal to most species. To humans, with our specific neurological architecture, extremely lethal. An assassination system worn on the body, designed to look like equipment, designed to be delivered in close contact with a target. Designed for me. And somewhere between the moment I'd had it in a grapple and the moment we were all sitting in a cold corridor sharing a terminal screen, it had dismantled the thing. Quietly, manually, without drawing attention to it. Taken it apart and apparently done something with the components, though a full search of the alcove later found only part of what should have been there. The rest, Harrow theorized, had been chemically neutralized by some internal process the Vreth had initiated. It had disarmed itself, voluntarily, without being asked. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Nobody told it to, nobody negotiated for it, it just did it. On its own. At some point during those hours when it was watching Harrow work and listening to Vash talk and looking at Destai and looking at me. It had come here as an instrument of someone's intent, and it had decided, on its own terms, to become something else. I will file a formal incident report through official channels. This document is my personal addendum, which I am filing because I believe the formal report will be sanitized in ways that lose the substance of what happened, and I want the substance to exist somewhere. By 600 on March 15th, we had the following situation. One Vreth instrument, unregistered, present on Kepler Station Outpost 9, no hostile posture, voluntarily disarmed, engaged in preliminary non-verbal communication with our xenobiology team. One staff sergeant with a minor wound, and a performance that will be cited in training materials for the next 50 years. One probable leak within the galactic Concordat infrastructure that had given someone enough knowledge of the Vreth to hire one. And a set of questions that I started listing in my head at about 5:30 and hadn't stopped adding to. What I chose to do in the immediate term was relatively simple. I requested temporary extended observer status for the Vreth through the emergency diplomatic protocols of the Akari Accords. The Accords have a clause, used exactly once before in their 60-year history, that allows a station commander to designate an unregistered individual as a protected provisional contact for a period of 30 standard days, pending full diplomatic review. The reasoning has to be documented. The reasoning I documented was, the individual has demonstrated restraint, voluntary communication, and voluntary disarmament. The individual appears to have information relevant to a security breach within Concordat infrastructure. The individual is a first contact opportunity with an unregistered species of unknown but significant historical depth. All of that was true. The real reason, which I wrote nowhere in the official request, is simpler. An instrument had been sent to kill a human being, and the instrument had refused. And whatever the political dimensions and the security implications and the diplomatic complexities, that fact seemed to me like something worth treating carefully rather than immediately overriding with protocol. Something had happened in that service corridor, something that I don't have clean words for either. Something that mattered. I wasn't going to throw it away to clear a paperwork backlog. The Concordat's response to my provisional contact request was an automated acknowledgement followed by 6 hours of silence, which told me the request had gone somewhere above the automated acknowledgement level. What came back at around 1400 that afternoon was an authorization provisional, hedged with 17 conditions, requiring bi-daily reports, but an authorization. The Vreth was staying. I asked to file this second document because I wanted to record some things that happened after the night itself. The formal incident report covers the night. This is about the week. The Vreth was given a space in the observer section, A modified storage room, really, with the environmental controls adjusted based on Dr. Harrow's best assessment of what atmospheric conditions its biology preferred. It was uncomfortable at first, the atmosphere thing, because Harrow was guessing, and for the first couple of days, the Vreth's markings showed patterns she interpreted as mild physical distress. She kept adjusting the composition until it settled into something calmer. That small thing, the watching and adjusting and trying to get the atmosphere right, I think meant something to it. I don't have scientific evidence for that, just an impression. Riku visited every day. Commander Vash had authorized limited access to the provisional contact space, and Riku was on the access list because Command had decided, fairly reasonably, that the Vreth's behavior suggested Riku was some kind of reference point for it. So Riku would go in once a day, usually in the afternoon. He'd sit at the designated distance safety protocols. Harrow was very particular about those, and he'd talk. He told his daughter about it in a transmission home. He said he was talking to someone new. She asked if the person was nice. He said he was figuring that out. She sent back a drawing. Little kid's drawing, the way she always did, of a person, and next to the person another shape that she'd colored with a gray crayon. Underneath it she'd written in her 7-year-old handwriting, sounding out the letters slowly, FREN. Riku showed it to the Vreth through the safety barrier. Harrow, watching the marking patterns, made that almost laugh sound again. On the 4th day, the Vreth produced something. It had been creating, carefully, quietly, using its own materials, some of those components from the harness that hadn't been neutralized, rearranged and refashioned in ways that Harrow was still cataloging. What it produced was small, flat, and patterned on its surface with markings that weren't bioluminescent, weren't alive but were clearly deliberate, arranged, specific. Harrow spent a full day working on the pattern with her structural analysis tools. What she eventually told us was that the pattern appeared to be a name. Not a human name, not anything in our phonetic range, but a name, the Vreth's own signifier for itself, a name it had given us. And next to it in the same marking language, something that Harrow interpreted with her usual careful hedging as the approximate meaning of, I was sent. I chose otherwise. This is who I am when I choose. I've been thinking about that a lot this week. This is who I am when I choose. Not who I was made to be. Not what I was directed to do. Who I am when the choice is mine. On the 6th day, we got word through the diplomatic channel that the Concordat Oversight Committee was sending a full review team. 12 people, traveling aboard a Concordat vessel that would arrive in approximately 3 weeks. The formal status of the Vreth contact would be determined at that point. Commander Vash briefed us. He said it would be a complicated review. He said to be honest in our reports and our testimonies. He said not to speculate beyond what we directly witnessed. Then he looked at Riku for a moment and said, "Whatever you've been doing in there, don't stop." Riku nodded. He hasn't stopped. I want to end this document with something small, because the big picture stuff, the Concordat politics, the leak investigation, the implications for human-Vreth relations, whatever those turn out to be, all of that is above my rank and my clearance and my current ability to think about clearly. The small thing is this. On the 7th morning, I walked past the provisional contact space on my way to the start of my shift. The door has a small observation window, reinforced, rated for well beyond anything you'd expect from a modified storage room, because Command was thorough like that. I looked in. Riku was sitting in his chair. The Vreth was in its designated position on the other side of the safety barrier. Between them on the barrier panel, Riku had propped up his daughter's drawing, the gray crayon shape next to the person. They were both looking at it. That's all, nothing else was happening. No communication, no documentation, no protocol. Just two creatures from different ends of the galaxy, sitting quietly, looking at a child's drawing of two beings standing next to each other. The word she'd spelled out at the bottom, FREN. I don't know what comes next. I don't know what the review team will decide, or what the Concordat will do, or what this means for the investigation into who tried to use the Vreth against us. I don't know if the Vreth and humans will ever build something across the gap between us. But I know that on the morning after the night an assassin attacked a human, the assassin was still here. And so was the human it was sent to kill. And they were sitting together in a room, and no one was dead. I think that matters. I'm not sure why, not in any way I can articulate cleanly, but I think it does. I think it matters very much. I want to add one thing, a note, unofficial. In the 43 years I have worked in xenobiology, I have studied non-human life in every form available to me. I have cataloged behavior and mapped communication, and built structural analyses of language and filed reports, and given testimony and answered questions, and contributed to the slowly accumulating body of knowledge that humanity has gathered about the universe and the life it contains. In all of that time, in all of those studies, I have never encountered anything quite like what I observed in that service corridor and in the days that followed. We talk about intelligence as a category. We talk about sapience, sentience, the various markers we use to determine whether something is a person or not a person. The criteria change. The debates continue. They are fascinating debates, and I have contributed to some of them. What I observed with the Vreth was something that doesn't fit cleanly into those debates, something underneath them maybe, something prior. An entity that arrived with a purpose, and then, upon encountering the reality of that purpose, upon encountering the human reality of it, changed. Not was changed, changed from the inside. We don't fully understand what humans looked like to it when it arrived. We don't know what it had been told, what data it had been given, what framework it was operating within when it came through that airlock. But we know what it did when it got close enough to actually encounter us, actually see us, actually feel the physical resistance of a human body that refused to stop being alive. It stopped. In the Vreth structural language, as best I can interpret it, there is a concept that has no clean equivalent in any Concordat language, and a somewhat approximate one in human language. It describes the state of an instrument that has come into contact with something it was not prepared for, something that cannot be accounted for by its prior understanding, and has chosen to remain in that state rather than resolve it by force. The closest human concept, I think, is wonder. The Vreth came here as an instrument of someone's will, and it encountered humans and it felt wonder. And it changed. I've been a scientist my whole life. I believe in documentation, in evidence, in the slow accumulation of verified data. I'm not given to large statements about the meaning of things. But I will say this. In every conflict, in every contact, in every encounter between humans and the galaxy's older and more powerful and more certain residents, the thing that consistently catches them off guard is not our weapons or our numbers or our military technology. It is this, whatever this is. Whatever it is, that makes a trained instrument stop mid-mission, because it encountered a human and felt wonder. Whatever it is, that makes a wounded soldier talk quietly to something he can't understand, without fear, without performance, without anything except the genuine attempt at contact. Whatever it is that a 7-year-old child draws in gray crayon and labels with a word she's still learning to spell. We keep calling it a mystery. The other species, the ones that have studied us and debated us and feared us and tried to manage us, they keep treating it as a variable they can't account for. I'm starting to think it's not a mystery. I'm starting to think it's just us. I'm starting to think that's enough.